It's great you've tuned in today. Welcome to regulars and also to new friends. Today I want to do something rather different. I want to tell you a story. We make sense of our lives by telling stories. Stories about who we are and where we've come from, where we're going and what matters to us. We tell bigger stories to make sense of our communities and our world. Today I want to tell you the story that makes sense of everything. Where should we start? At the beginning? Does everything have a beginning? A small boy once asked me that, and it's a great question. If everything has a beginning, then before the beginning of the first thing, there was nothing. And if there was nothing, really nothing, then nothing could have happened. So there must be something that doesn't have a beginning, something that started everything else. But in this story that makes sense of everything, the beginningless something is not a something at all, but a someone, a person, the great person. And that is why, in our world, people matter more than anything else. Before anything else began, this great person already was. There was no one to know who he was but himself. And he said of himself, I am. I am, because I have always been, and I always will be. So we will call him I Am. There was nothing else, only I Am. But I Am was not lonely, because I Am was not alone. He was with himself, perfectly satisfied, overflowing with speech and love within himself. In the beginning, I Am created everything else. Now there were two things, I Am, who came first, and everything else which depended upon him. I Am was like an artist who makes his own paper and his own paints. I Am formed a world of day and night, sea and sky, land and growing things. Then he filled the world that he had formed, the sun for the day, and the moon and stars for the night, birds for the sky and fish for the sea, and animals, every sort of animal. And it was all good, but it wasn't finished. I Am had saved the best until last. His masterpiece was to be people. People like him, people who loved and spoke and made things, people to look after the world. And now it was very good. The first of these people was called human, because that's what he was, the first human. And not just the first, but in a sense, all of us rolled up into one. He was the original, and he was to fill the world with copies of himself. Human and his children would rule that good and happy world, so that everything would grow and flourish and become what it could be. But human was alone, and that wasn't good. The animals were his willing subjects, but he needed a friend, a partner. So I Am built him a wife, from him and for him and with him. Wow! Human and his wife were equal but different. And now the world could overflow with love and speech, just like I Am himself. But first there was a great question to be answered. Before the beginning, there was only I Am, perfect in unity and harmony, agreement and good. But now there was someone else, human, someone who could think and love and choose. But would he think true thoughts and love good things and choose right paths? His garden world was good, trees and fruit, rivers and resources, but would he be good? Of course, why wouldn't he? But there was still a choice, still a chance. And so I Am rolled up that choice into one place and explained it to human. The world would be his to use and enjoy, but something wasn't his. And that was the right to say what was right and wrong. That was I Am's job. Because I Am saw everything and knew everything and made everything. He said what was good and what was not. If human walked with I Am, then all would be well. But if he walked away, then he would walk out of light into darkness, out of joy into misery, out of life into death. It had to be that way, because I Am was light and joy and life. He was the source and the fountain. There was nowhere else to go but outside. So that was the choice. We make sense of our world by telling stories. And the world we try to make sense of is a world full of darkness and misery and death. People are guilty and fearful, ashamed and vulnerable. We blame one another. Families break up. And all around us nature groans and decays, with floods and stinging nettles and viruses. And people die, always in the end. Why is it like that? Because Human and his wife believed a lie. They decided to choose their own right and wrong, and it was all wrong. But I Am's words were true, and his warnings were real. The day that they rebelled, death slipped into the world, an unwelcome intruder, just as I Am had warned them. Now the original Human was broken, and all the copies would be flawed. Every day since, the growing family of Human and his wife have been repeating that fateful choice, listening to lies, thinking they know better than I Am, who made everything. Human and his wife rejected I Am. But on that very day, I Am gave them something they didn't deserve. He gave them hope. He gave them hope by giving them the promise. One day, a child would be born into their family who would put things right. It would be a costly victory. There was no way back, but one day there would be a way forward. And so Human gave his wife a name of hope. He called her Life. Human and Life could not stay in their garden home. The world outside had become hostile and dangerous, but there was no way back, only the promise. Human and Life had children, and their children had children. They became farmers and shepherds, and they made things, tents and cities and music and tools. But they also told lies. The first child who was ever born grew up to kill his brother. Men mistreated women and ignored I Am's pattern. The Human family spread, but so did anger and pride and death, always death. And so the years passed and the centuries. Some people remembered I Am, but only a few. When they cried out to him, he heard them, but it was only a few. And it was hard to live. Ploughing and sowing and reaping were hard. Human and Life had brought a curse on the ground. One day a little boy was born, and they named him Relief. They hoped he would bring them relief and comfort amidst all the hard work and misery. But things only got worse. In the end, every thought of every person was only evil all the time. And when I Am looked at the world which he had made so very good, his heart was grieved, and he spoke. It's time. Time to blot out the whole human family, every living thing, except what? Except for that one man, Relief. Relief was different. He was one of those few who remembered I Am. Relief would do what I Am commanded. He would be the new beginning, the new Human, and everything would start again. And so I Am would keep the promise. And so it was. A mighty disaster swept across the face of the earth, and all life was blotted out, together with all the hating and hurting. But there was one safe place. Relief had built a haven for his family, and pairs of every animal, and from that one safe place the world was reseeded, and life began again. What would the new humanity be like? It would take more than a new beginning to fix the bent in the human heart. And so the human race grew again and spread again. But so did pride and rebellion and death. But it was a different world, splintering into fragments of language and culture, peoples and nations, just as it is today. It was then that I Am revealed his master plan. I Am's master plan was a people and a person. From the growing city-states, he chose a man to be the founder of a new nation. The man's name was Highfather, but I Am changed his name to Crowdfather. It seemed rather an odd choice. Crowdfather was quite an old man, and he and his wife had no children, let alone a crowd of them. But I Am knew what he was doing. Having made a universe, one childless couple would hardly prove a problem. So I Am called Crowdfather to leave his old home and to travel the length of the known world to a new place. It would be a garden land for I Am's people, One day, this would be the people and the place where I Am would keep that first great promise and send a rescuer. And so Crowdfather went, trusting. It seemed laughable, but in the end, that first child came, and so they called him Laughter. Laughter too had a son, and called him Snatch, and Snatch had 12 sons. The promised crowd was starting to emerge. The years passed, and the centuries. Crowdfather's family grew into a nation, I Am's chosen people. At first they were a people in slavery, but I Am rescued them and took them back to the garden land that he had promised. In the end, I Am gave them a king called Beloved, who taught them to sing praises. All the time, I Am's promise was growing. It started, you remember, back on the day that human and life first rebelled. The promise was that one of their children's children would put things right. Then I Am told Crowdfather that this blessing for the world would come through his family, the nation that he would become. And now I Am had told King Beloved that the promised one, the blessing bringer, would be a king in his royal line. There was no other nation in the whole world like I Am's people. They had been chosen and rescued and placed in a garden land. And now they had a choice. It was the same choice that human faced back in the beginning, when the world was perfect. Would they walk with I Am? Would they say that he knew best? Would they live by his right and wrong? That was the path of joy and life. That way they would be a light to the other nations, a blessing to the world. Or would they go their own way? I Am had given them the same warning. That path, away from him, was a path into misery and exile, banishment from his presence. But the story of I Am's people was the story of human all over again. They failed to trust I Am as Crowdfather had trusted him. And they failed to love I Am as King Beloved had loved him. Instead, they chose the path of rebellion and reaped the same miserable consequences. They too were banished from their garden land, at least for a time. And when they did return, they were not their own. They were no longer free. Overlords ruled their land. And so the long years passed, and the centuries. Centuries of waiting and hoping, hardly daring to believe that the promise might still come true. I Am's world had been spoilt by the human race. I Am's people had proved just as faithless. And King Beloved's royal line had dwindled to almost nothing. But I Am knew what he was doing. Everything was going according to plan, though things had never looked worse. I Am specialised in impossible situations. Out of nothing, he had made a universe. Out of an old and childless couple, he had made a nation. And now, from the miserable state of his people, he was going to bring forth at last the promised one. We make sense of our world by telling stories. The best stories contain a surprising twist. And the story that makes sense of everything has the most surprising twist of all. In the beginning, I Am created everything else. And after that, there were two things. I Am, who came first, and everything else which depended upon him. I Am was the storyteller, and the universe was his story. I Am was the artist, and the world was his masterpiece. But now I Am was going to paint himself into his picture. He was going to write himself into his story. A child would be born who was just as human as any other child, and yet in the person of that child, I Am himself would enter his world, not just as creator, but also as creature. From before the beginning, I Am had been with himself, more than one, yet only one, and now the more than oneness of I Am would be revealed in this child. Now at last, the greatest mystery of all was beginning to emerge. I Am was both speaker and word, both sender and sent, both lover and returner of love. I Am was father and son. And that is why Son had no human father. He was as human as his mother, but Father was his Father, as he had always been, when they had been one and together, loving and loved, before anything was made. And now Son had entered the world, fully human, yet fully I Am, come to rescue his broken people and to put things right. What would happen now? I Am had entered his world in the person of Son. Human and life had been banished from the garden, but I Am had followed them into the world outside, into all its spoiltness and pain. What would happen now? At first, no one noticed. Who would notice a baby, a refugee, a woodworker's boy, even though that woodworker was a direct descendant of King Beloved? At first, no one noticed. And so the years passed, and Son grew into manhood, wise and good and strong. And every single day of his ordinary life, something extraordinary was happening. Son was choosing to do what was good and right. He trusted and he loved. Human and life had failed. They had chosen their own right and wrong. But Son always lived by Father's right and wrong. I Am's people had failed, turning their back on the one who had chosen and rescued them. But Son never turned his back on Father, not even for a moment. Son was everything that I Am's people had failed to be. At last it was time. Son stepped forward onto the public stage, and the broken world saw something that they had never seen before. A life that was all truth and all love. A life that was lived for others. I Am's power was bursting through, transforming broken people. Blind people had their eyes opened. Deaf people heard. Lame people jumped for joy. Even the dead were raised. But there was something else. A spotlight of truth was shining into hearts, proud hearts, hypocritical hearts, envious hearts. And in the end, it was too much. There was a showdown. I Am had left the garden in search of a lost people. But when he came and lived among them, they turned all the hatred and hurting onto him. And so they strung him up and left him to die. That was what the choice in the garden had always meant. That was where it led. The ultimate defiance and rebellion. That was how it ended. Hatred had won. Darkness had extinguished the light. Or so it seemed. But everything had been leading up to this point, this moment. This was to be I Am's masterstroke. When I Am made the world, the pinnacle was human and life. When they stumbled, all creation stumbled with them. When they chose the path of death, everything began to die. So I Am made a nation, his people, and all the hope of the world was tied up with them. But they too stumbled. The answer proved as broken as the problem, and death continued to rule. But into that nation was born a child, the promised one, the blessing bringer, I Am himself, Son. And he also chose a path that led to his death. But it was not a path of rebellion, but of love and trust. All the hopes of the people and the whole world were bound up with him. And so when he rose from the grave, the whole people and the whole world and the whole universe turned a corner. Yes, he came back to life. Did you think that I Am would stay dead? He was life and joy and light. Light wins. Justice had been satisfied, and now everything was different. I Am was Father and Son, speaker and word, but he was also breath, and now the breath of I Am was invading his world. Before I Am came, his people were a single nation, separate from the nations, set apart. But I Am's plan was always for the whole world. And so now his people were no longer a nation apart, but people from every nation, and new people. I Am's breath was filling people one by one. Lives were changing, a person at a time. But the task was not yet complete. Way back was the day when everything went wrong, the day that human chose a path of rebellion and death. And so there would also be a day when everything was put right. Once again, I Am would invade his world in the person of Son, the promised one, the blessing bringer. I Am would come again, not as a child, but as a king, not to carry human rebellion to the grave, but to rescue the people who were waiting for him. Then what? Would it be the end? Certainly the end of all rebellion, the end of the path for those who had chosen darkness and misery and death. But no longer would darkness and misery and death be able to spoil I Am's good world. Would it be the end? Or rather, the beginning? The beginning of the world as it was meant to be. Life and joy and light forever. And there, at the centre, would be the one who had always been at the centre, overflowing with love and speech. I Am, but no longer alone. No longer alone, but Father and Son, surrounded by breath-filled worshippers, loving and trusting forever and ever. And then the story would truly begin, blossoming forth from the greatest story ever told, the story that made sense of everything. Speaker, word, and breath. And his people, chosen in deadness, rescued in love, and lost in wonder. So it will be.